The morning sun peeked through the old curtains of Frank Thompson's bedroom window. At 93 years old, Frank still woke up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m. every day, a habit he kept from his military days. His weathered hands reached for the wooden cane beside his bed, the same way they had done for the past 5 years. Frank lived alone in a small white house on Sater Street, just outside of town. The house wasn't fancy, but it had character. The paint was starting to peel in some places, but the garden in front was perfect. Every morning, Frank would tend to his roses, the ones he and his late wife Martha had planted together 30 years ago. People in town knew Frank well. He was the kind old veteran who always wore his navy blue veteran's cap with World War IO, Pacific Theater, written in gold letters. His white hair was always neatly combed, and despite his age, he stood as straight as he could. His blue eyes might have grown lighter with age, but they still held the sharp look of a man who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. That morning, like every morning, Frank got dressed in his pressed khaki pants and a clean white shirt. He made his simple breakfast: 2 eggs, toast, and black coffee. As he sat at his kitchen table, he looked at Martha's photo on the wall and smiled. "Another day, my dear," he whispered, a morning ritual he never skipped. The small town of Pine Ridge, Montana, was usually quiet, especially on weekday mornings. Frank enjoyed his morning walks to Joe's Diner, where he would sit at his regular spot, the third booth from the door. Sally, the waitress who had worked there for 20 years, always had his coffee ready. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Sally called out as Frank pushed open the diner's door, the little bell above it ringing. "Your usual spot is waiting." Frank smiled and nodded, walking carefully to his booth. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, making the old veteran's medals on his cap shine. Young Tommy, a 12-year-old boy who often came to the diner with his mother, ran up to Frank's table. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell me another war story?" Tommy's eyes were bright with excitement. His mother, Jane, worked as a teacher at the local school, and she always encouraged Tommy to talk to Frank, saying it was like living history. Frank's eyes twinkled as he settled into his seat. "Well, young man, have I told you about the time we were stationed in the Philippines?" He took a sip of the coffee Sally had brought over and began sharing his memories. The diner grew quiet as Frank spoke. He never told the violent parts of his stories, instead focusing on the brotherhood, the courage, and the small acts of kindness he witnessed during those difficult years. His voice was soft but clear, carrying the weight of memories that were both heavy and precious. As Frank talked, more people gathered around his booth. There was Bob, the local mechanic, taking his morning break. Sarah, who ran the flower shop across the street, stopped by with a fresh muffin for Frank. Even Mr. Peterson, the bank manager, stood quietly listening, his coffee getting cold in his hand. Frank didn't mind the attention, but he never sought it. He believed in sharing these stories to keep the memories of his fallen friends alive, and to help the younger generation understand what their freedom cost. After finishing his story and his second cup of coffee, Frank carefully stood up. He left his usual tip for Sally, always a little more than necessary because her youngest was in college. The morning sun had grown stronger as he stepped outside, making him squint slightly. Walking back home, Frank stopped to chat with Mrs. Anderson, who was watering her plants. He picked up his morning paper from his front yard and checked his mailbox. Everything was normal, peaceful, just the way he liked it. Little did Frank know that this quiet life he had built for himself was about to face an unexpected challenge. As he entered his house and settled in his favorite armchair by the window, he heard the distant rumble of motorcycles, a sound that would soon become all too familiar in his peaceful neighborhood. But for now, Frank simply opened his newspaper, adjusted his reading glasses, and enjoyed the quiet morning, unaware that his biggest test since the war was just around the corner. The peaceful afternoons that Frank Thompson had grown used to change suddenly one warm Tuesday in May. The rumbling sound of motorcycles grew louder as a group of 15 bikers roared down his quiet street. Their black leather jackets gleamed in the sun, and their bikes were covered in chrome that flashed like lightning. At first, Frank watched from his front porch, rocking slowly in his chair. He didn't mind people passing through, after all, the road was public. But then 3 of the motorcycles turned into his driveway, their tires rolling over the edge of his carefully tended lawn. "Excuse me," Frank called out, his voice firm despite his age. "This is private property." He gripped his cane and stood up slowly. The bikers pretended not to hear him. They kicked down their stands and got off their bikes, leaving them parked on Frank's grass. The largest one, a man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, laughed loudly. "Look at this, boys. Grandpa's got something to say," the man called out, making the others snicker. Frank noticed the patch on their jackets that read Road Warriors MC. Sally from the diner happened to be driving by. She slowed down, worry clear on her face, but Frank waved to show he was okay. He didn't want anyone getting involved and possibly getting hurt. "Young man," Frank said calmly, "I fought for this country so people could be free, not so they could disrespect others' property." His blue eyes were steady as he looked at the group. "Oh, did you hear that?" Another biker with a shaved head mockingly asked his friends. "He fought for our freedom." "Well, we're just exercising that freedom, old-timer." More laughter followed. The bikers sprawled out on Frank's lawn, pulling out cigarettes and beer cans. They left their trash scattered around when they finally left an hour later, the roar of their engines drowning out any other sound in the neighborhood. Frank spent the next hour picking up their garbage, his joints aching as he bent down again and again. Young Tommy from the diner saw him and ran over to help. "Mr. Thompson, why did you let them do that?" Tommy asked, holding a trash bag open. Frank smiled gently. "Sometimes, Tommy, it's better to be smart than to be tough. Those men are angry about something. I've seen that kind of anger before in the war." The next day, the bikers came back. This time, they brought more friends. 8 motorcycles parked on Frank's property, their owners lounging around as if they owned the place. Some of them even started using his garden fountain as an ashtray. Word spread quickly in the small town. Sheriff Roberts drove by, but he only slowed down, looked worried, and kept going. Frank later learned that the motorcycle club had caused trouble in other towns, and no one wanted to confront them. That night, Frank sat in his living room, looking at old photographs. There was one of him in his uniform, standing proud with his fellow soldiers in 1944. Another showed him and Martha on their wedding day, both of them young and full of hope. He wondered what Martha would say about this situation. The next morning, Frank found his mailbox knocked over. As he tried to fix it, the bikers returned. This time, they brought a boombox, playing loud music that shook his windows. His neighbors all stayed inside, their curtains drawn. "Hey, old man," the bearded leader shouted. "Better get used to us. We like your yard. It's our new hangout spot." Frank stood at his window, watching them trash his property again. His hands were steady as he picked up his phone, but he didn't call the police. Instead, he began to form a plan. If fighting in World War II had taught him anything, it was that sometimes the best strategy isn't the most obvious one. As the sun set that evening, Frank sat in his favorite chair, writing in his notebook. The sound of motorcycles had faded, but the mess they left behind was clear in his front yard. Tomorrow would be different, he decided. Tomorrow, he would try something that none of them would expect. The morning started with a shock that made Frank's heart sink. Someone had spray-painted his white fence during the night. The black letters spelled out "Old Soldier equals Old Fool." Next to it was a crude drawing making fun of his military service. Frank stood there in his morning robe, his coffee cup shaking slightly in his hand. It was the first time since 1945 that his hands had trembled. Not from fear. Frank Thompson had faced far worse in the Pacific, but from a deep sadness about how people could treat each other this way. "Mr. Thompson." Tommy came running down the street, his backpack bouncing as he headed to school. Then the boy stopped suddenly, seeing the graffiti. His young face turned red with anger. "I'll help you clean it, Mr. Thompson. Those bikers are just big bullies." Frank put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Thank you, son, but you need to get to school. Don't be late on my account." He managed to smile, but his eyes were tired. By noon, the Road Warriors were back, their motorcycles even louder than before. This time, they brought a grill and set it upright on Frank's lawn. The smell of burning charcoal and cooking meat filled the air, while empty beer cans rolled across the grass. "Hey, war hero," the bearded leader shouted, waving a hamburger. "Want some lunch? Oh wait, it's probably past your bedtime already." The other bikers laughed, their voices carrying across the neighborhood. Mrs. Anderson from next door peeked out her window, then quickly called Frank. "Frank, dear, should I call the police?" Her worried voice came through the phone. "No, Helen," Frank replied calmly. The sheriff already made it clear he won't help. Sometimes we have to solve problems our own way. As Frank watched from his window, he noticed something interesting. One of the younger bikers had a Marine Corps tattoo on his arm. Another wore boots that Frank recognized, standard issue for recent Afghanistan veterans. His mind started working on an idea. Later that afternoon, the bikers decided to really show their disrespect. They found Frank's old flagpole, the one where he raised the American flag every morning, and tied their club banner to it. The American flag lay crumpled on the ground. Something changed in Frank's eyes when he saw that. He walked outside, his back straight despite his age, and picked up the flag. With careful movements, he folded it properly in the triangle shape used at military funerals. The bikers watched, unusually quiet. "You boys think you know something about disrespect," Frank said, his voice carrying across the yard. "But you don't know the first thing about respect, or what it costs." The bearded leader stepped forward, trying to look tough. "What do you mean by that, old-timer?" Frank held up the folded flag. "This flag was on my best friend's coffin before his family gave it to me. Jimmy Chen died saving my life on Iwo Jima. He jumped on a grenade that would have killed me and 3 other men." Frank's voice was steady now, his blue eyes sharp as steel. Some of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably. The one with the Marine tattoo looked down at his boots. "You want to mock an old man? Fine. Want to trash my property? I've seen worse. But disrespecting this flag..." Frank shook his head slowly. "You're disrespecting every brother and sister in uniform who never made it home." A heavy silence fell over the yard. Even the bearded leader seemed unsure what to say. But then he forced a laugh, trying to hide his discomfort. "Whatever, Gramps. Let's get out of here. This place is boring anyway." He kicked his motorcycle to life, and the others followed. As they roared away, Frank carefully carried the flag inside. He placed it in its special display case, next to his medals and a faded photograph of him and Jimmy Chen, both young and smiling in their uniforms. That night, as Frank sat in his chair thinking, he realized something important. These bikers weren't just angry, they were lost. And maybe, just maybe, that was something he could understand. Tomorrow, he decided, would be the day he put his plan into action. That evening, Frank couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, surrounded by old photographs and memories. The table lamp cast a warm glow over his military medals, each one telling a story of courage and sacrifice. His hands moved slowly over a wooden box that held his most precious memories from the war. The sound of breaking glass shattered the night's quiet. Frank grabbed his cane and moved to the window. In the moonlight, he could see several of the bikers stumbling through his garden. They were drunk, laughing as they knocked over his flower pots. "Hey, look what I found!" One of them shouted, holding up a small garden sign. It was the handmade wooden marker that read "Martha's Roses," which Frank had carved for his late wife's birthday 20 years ago. Frank's heart stopped as the biker snapped the sign in half and tossed it aside. Then they started stepping on the roses themselves, crushing the delicate flowers that Frank had tended so carefully every day since Martha's passing. For the first time since the bikers had arrived, Frank felt tears in his eyes. Those roses were more than just flowers. They were his last living connection to Martha. Every morning when he watered them, he would talk to her, telling her about his day, keeping her memory alive. Unable to watch any more, Frank turned away from the window. His eyes fell on an old photograph on his desk. It showed him as a young sergeant, standing with his platoon in the Pacific. They were dirty and tired, but their eyes showed something special, a bond that went deeper than friendship. Frank picked up the photo with trembling hands. Next to it lay his Silver Star Medal, awarded for saving 3 men in his unit during a fierce battle. The citation read, "Sergeant Thompson displayed extraordinary courage and leadership in the face of overwhelming odds." Leadership, Frank whispered to himself. Something clicked in his mind. He spent the next hour going through his old military footlocker. Inside, he found his dress uniform, still perfectly pressed after all these years. His fingers traced the combat ribbons and unit patches. Each one brought back memories of lessons learned about dealing with conflict and understanding young men full of anger. As he dug deeper, he found a stack of letters, correspondence with some of his old unit members over the years. Many wrote about their struggles after coming home from war, about feeling lost and angry, about finding peace through understanding and brotherhood. Frank walked to his window again. The bikers were gone, but the destruction they left behind was clear in the moonlight. His beautiful rose garden, tended with love for decades, lay in ruins. But as he looked at the damage, he didn't feel anger anymore. Instead, he felt something different: determination. He remembered what his old commanding officer used to say: the best way to defeat an enemy is to make them your friend. Looking at the young bikers, especially the ones with military tattoos, Frank recognized something he'd seen before: the lost look of soldiers who couldn't find their way home. Taking out a notebook, Frank began to write. His plan would need to be careful, well thought out, just like the operations he used to plan during the war. But this time, the goal wasn't to defeat an enemy, it was to build a bridge. As the first light of dawn began to show in the sky, Frank was still awake. He had changed into his dress uniform, each medal and ribbon perfectly placed. Looking in the mirror, he stood straight despite his age. The uniform still fit, and more importantly, it reminded him of who he was: not just an old man who had been bullied, but a leader who had guided young men through their darkest times. On his desk lay his finished plan. Tomorrow, he would do something completely unexpected. The bikers thought they knew what kind of man he was, but they were about to learn that old soldiers never lose their ability to surprise, or to lead. As the sun rose, Frank finally allowed himself to rest. Tomorrow would be an important day, perhaps as important as any he had faced in the war. But this time, his weapons would be wisdom and understanding, not rifles and grenades. The next morning, Frank was up before sunrise. His body was tired from the sleepless night, but his mind was sharp and focused. He put on his dress uniform again, making sure every medal and ribbon was perfectly straight. Then he began to put his plan into action. First, he called Tommy's mother, Jane. "Mrs. Parker, could Tommy skip his morning visit today? What I'm about to do might get a little tense." After reassuring her that he was fine, Frank made his next move. He brought out 6 folding chairs from his garage and set them up on his lawn, arranging them in a neat semicircle. Next to them, he placed a large cooler filled with sodas and water. On a small table, he carefully laid out old photographs from his war days, including pictures of young soldiers in different uniforms from World War II all the way to recent conflicts. The neighbors watched from their windows as Frank put up a simple hand-painted sign. It read, "Veterans welcome, all eras, all branches, free drinks and stories to share." Mrs. Anderson came out of her house worried. "Frank, what are you doing? Those horrible bikers will be back soon." Frank smiled gently. "That's exactly what I'm counting on, Helen. Sometimes the best way to stop a fight is to start a conversation." Around 10 a.m., the familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the street. The road warriors came around the corner, their bikes roaring. They stopped short when they saw Frank standing in his front yard, tall and proud in his full-dress uniform, all his medals gleaming in the morning sun. The bearded leader, who had seemed so tough before, looked confused. "What's this supposed to be, old-timer? Some kind of joke?" Frank walked forward, his cane tapping softly on the ground. "No joke, son. I noticed some of your younger members have served. Thought maybe we could share some stories, veteran to veteran." The biker with the Marine Corps tattoo shifted uncomfortably on his bike. Another one, who wore combat boots, couldn't take his eyes off Frank's combat ribbons. "You boys like to act tough," Frank continued, his voice clear and strong. "But I bet none of you are as tough as my friend Jimmy Chen. He was barely 20 when he jumped on that grenade to save 4 of his brothers." Frank pointed to a photo on the table, showing a young Chinese-American soldier smiling at the camera. Some of the bikers got off their motorcycles, drawn by the photographs. The young Marine walked closer, looking at a picture of Frank's old unit. "That's Guadalcanal," Frank said. "We were just kids too, scared out of our minds but trying not to show it. Kind of like how some of you might have felt in Iraq or Afghanistan." The Marine's tough expression cracked a little. How did you know?" "The way you carry yourself, son, the look in your eyes. I've seen it before, in every war. The hard part isn't the fighting, it's the coming home." More bikers moved closer now, their earlier hostility fading into curiosity. Frank opened the cooler and started handing out drinks. "My wife Martha always said that cold drinks make for better conversations," he said, smiling at the memory. "Now, who wants to hear about the time our whole unit got lost in the jungle and ended up behind enemy lines?" The bearded leader was the last to join the group, but even he couldn't resist when Frank pointed to his Vietnam-era boots. "Those are original jungle boots, aren't they? Must have belonged to someone who served." "My dad's," the leader admitted quietly. He didn't talk about the war much." Frank nodded understandingly. "Many don't. That's why it's important for those of us who can talk about it to do so. Helps the younger ones understand they're not alone." As the morning sun rose higher, something extraordinary happened on Frank's lawn. The tough-looking bikers sat in those folding chairs, listening to an old veteran's stories. And slowly, very slowly, some of them began to share their own. The afternoon sun was warm as Frank shared more stories with the bikers. The tough group that had terrorized his property for days now sat quietly, completely absorbed in his tales. Even passing cars slowed down, their drivers amazed to see the scene on Frank's lawn. Mike, the young Marine with the tattoo, leaned forward in his chair. "So what happened after your buddy Jimmy saved everyone?" His voice was different now, respectful and genuinely interested. Frank's eyes grew distant as he remembered. They gave him the Medal of Honor. His mother received it at the White House. He paused, touching the silver star on his own uniform. "But you know what I remember most? How he used to share his chocolate bars with local kids, even when we barely had enough food ourselves." The bearded leader, who had finally introduced himself as Jake, cleared his throat. "My old man, he served in Vietnam. Found some of his medals after he passed last year. Never knew what they were for. He never talked about it." Frank nodded understanding. Many didn't. The weight of those memories can be heavy. He looked at Jake carefully. "Is that why you started the motorcycle club? Looking for that brotherhood you saw in your father's old military photos?" Jake's tough expression cracked slightly. He looked surprised, as if Frank had read his mind. "How did you know?" "Because that's what we all look for after service, that sense of belonging, that trust you had with your unit," Frank explained. "Some find it in family, some in work, and some," he gestured to their motorcycles, "find it on the road." One of the younger bikers who had been quiet until now suddenly spoke up. "2 tours in Afghanistan. Came back last year. Couldn't sleep, couldn't hold down a job. The bikes. The noise, it helps somehow. Drowns out the other noises in your head." Frank asked gently. The young man nodded, looking down at his hands. Frank stood up slowly, using his cane for support. "Come with me, boys. I want to show you something." He led them into his house, to his study. The walls were covered with photographs, not just from the war, but from decades of veterans' meetings and reunions. Every month, we used to meet. My old unit, the ones who made it home. We talked, we remembered, we helped each other heal. Frank pointed to a group photo. "Last meeting was 5 years ago. Only 3 of us left now." The bikers looked at the photos with new respect. Jake stopped at one that showed a younger Frank in his dress uniform, standing proudly next to a beautiful woman. "That's Martha, my wife," Frank said softly. "She ran a support group for veterans' wives, understood what it meant to love someone carrying those memories." "The roses," Jake said suddenly, remembering the garden they had destroyed. His face flushed with shame. "They were hers, weren't they?" Frank nodded. "She loved those roses. Taught me how to care for them before she passed. Said it would give me something to focus on, something to nurture." The room grew quiet. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. Finally, Mike spoke up. "Sir, we've been real idiots. Those roses, your property, the flag." He looked at his fellow bikers, who nodded in agreement. "We want to make it right." Jake stepped forward, standing straight like he might have seen his father do. "Mr. Thompson, if you'll let us, we'd like to help fix what we destroyed. And maybe," he hesitated, "maybe you could tell us more stories? About the war, about coming home, about finding peace." Frank looked at the group of bikers, seeing not the tough troublemakers from days before, but lost veterans looking for connection, understanding, and purpose. He smiled warmly. "Well, boys," he said, "I think Martha's roses could use some strong backs to help replant them, and I got plenty more stories to share while we work." The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to an unusual sight. Instead of the scary motorcycle gang that had terrorized the street, they saw a group of bikers carefully working in Frank's garden. Jake, the bearded leader, was on his knees, helping Frank plant new rose bushes. Careful with that one, Frank instructed, showing them how to spread the roots properly. Martha always said roses need gentle hands, even though they have thorns. Mike, the Marine, had brought his truck full of gardening supplies. Other bikers were repainting the fence, carefully covering up the old graffiti with fresh white paint. The sound of their motorcycles was replaced by the quiet sounds of work and occasional laughter. Tommy rode by on his bicycle, stopping in amazement. "Mr. Thompson, what's happening?" he asked, his eyes wide at the scene before him. Frank smiled. "These boys are helping me restore the garden, Tommy. Would you like to join us?" The young boy looked nervous at first, but then saw how different the bikers seemed today. "Can I really help?" Tommy asked. Jake walked over, his hands covered in dirt, and handed Tommy a small watering can. "Sure, kid. These roses need water after we plant them. Just be careful not to give them too much, right, Mr. Thompson?" As they worked, more neighbors began to come out of their houses. Mrs. Anderson brought over a pitcher of lemonade. "Well, I never thought I'd see the day," she said, smiling as she poured drinks for everyone. One of the younger bikers found Frank's old military photos that had fallen behind a bush during their earlier rowdy visits. The photo was in a scratched frame, showing Frank's unit in the Pacific. "Sir," he said, handling the photo carefully, "we could fix this frame for you. My uncle runs a frame shop in town." Frank looked at the photo. "That would be nice. Those men were my brothers. They deserve a proper display." As the morning went on, more members of the Road Warriors showed up. But this time, they came with tools, plants, and ready to help. The tough motorcycle club that had caused so much trouble was transforming into something different. During their lunch break, sitting on Frank's porch, Jake made an announcement. "Mr. Thompson, we've been talking. We want to make this right, not just today, but going forward." Mike stepped forward. "We're changing our club's mission. Instead of just riding around causing trouble, we want to help other veterans, like you helped us understand ourselves." Frank listened as they explained their plan. The Road Warriors would become a veterans support group, using their love of motorcycles to bring together servicemen and women who needed brotherhood and understanding. And, Jake added, "We'd be honored if you'd be our honorary president. We need your wisdom, sir." Frank's eyes grew misty. "Well, boys, that's quite an offer. But what would your other members think?" A deep voice spoke up from behind them. "They think it's about time." Everyone turned to see a tall, older man walking up the path. Jake's face showed shock. "Dad?" Jake stood up quickly. "What are you doing here?" The man, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, looked at his son. "Mrs. Anderson called me. Said my boy might have finally found his way." He turned to Frank and saluted. "Master Sergeant James Cooper, sir. Vietnam, 68 to 70. Frank returned the salute, then reached out to shake his hand. "Your son's a good man, Sergeant. Just needed to remember what it means to be part of something bigger than himself." As the afternoon sun began to set, Frank's property had been completely transformed. The garden was replanted, the fence gleaming with fresh paint, and the American flag flew proudly from a new flagpole the bikers had installed. But the biggest transformation wasn't in the garden. It was in the hearts of the men who had found something they didn't even know they were looking for: understanding, purpose, and the kind of brotherhood that only veterans truly understand. 3 months had passed since the day Frank Thompson had transformed his enemies into friends. His front yard, once the scene of conflict, had become something special. Every Saturday morning, motorcycles would line up neatly along the street, not to cause trouble, but to attend what the town now called Frank's Veterans Circle. Today was extra special. The roses were in full bloom, their sweet smell filling the air as veterans of all ages gathered in Frank's garden. The Road Warriors, now known as the Veterans Road Brothers, had set up chairs and a small podium. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Tommy said to his mother as they watched more motorcycles arrive. He was proudly wearing a junior assistant badge that the bikers had made specially for him. Jake, no longer the angry leader but now a respectful president of the veterans group, stepped up to the podium. His father, Sergeant Cooper, sat in the front row, beaming with pride. "3 months ago, we were lost," Jake began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We were angry, causing trouble, disrespecting a man who deserved our highest honor. But Mr. Thompson didn't see us as enemies. He saw us as brothers who had lost their way." Frank sat in his favorite chair, his dress uniform perfectly pressed. Around him, over 50 veterans had gathered, some from his own era, others from Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Many wore motorcycle gear, others came in suits or casual clothes, but all wore their service pins proudly. Mike, the Marine, stood up next. Since we started the Veterans Road Brothers, we've helped 20 veterans find jobs, set up 5 support groups across the state, and created a network for veterans who need someone to talk to. And it all started because one wise man chose understanding over anger. Mrs. Anderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as she watched from her porch. The sheriff, who had once been afraid to confront the bikers, now attended every meeting, proudly wearing his own veteran's pin. And now, Jake continued, we have a surprise for our honorary president, Mr. Frank Thompson. 2 bikers carefully brought forward a beautiful wooden display case. Inside was Frank's silver star, along with photographs of his unit and a small plate with words engraved on it. This display case was made by veterans, for a veteran, Jake explained. The wood came from trees grown on battlefields where Americans fought for freedom. And if you look closely at the photos, you'll see something special. Frank leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. There, carefully restored and beautifully framed, were all his old photographs, but next to them were new ones. Pictures of him with the Veterans Road Brothers, shots of them working in the garden, images of veterans helping veterans. You taught us that brotherhood doesn't end when the war does, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. It just takes new forms. Frank stood slowly, supported by his cane, and walked to the podium. Gathered veterans all stood at attention. When I was young, I fought for freedom, Frank said, his voice clear and strong despite his age. But it took me 93 years to learn that the greatest victory isn't winning a war. It's winning understanding. Looking at all of you today, I see what Martha always told me. Every garden needs both roses and thorns to be complete. The afternoon concluded with a barbecue in Frank's backyard. Veterans of different eras shared stories, younger riders learned from older ones, and healing happened in the simple act of being together. As the sun set, Frank sat on his porch, watching the last few motorcycles leave. Jake, Mike, and a few others stayed behind to clean up. Same time next week, Mr. Thompson? Jake asked. Frank smiled, looking at his garden where Martha's roses now bloomed alongside new plants, each one tended by veterans who had found their way home. Next week, he agreed, and every week after that, as long as there are veterans who need a place to belong. And so, the story of an old veteran and his unlikely friendship with a motorcycle club became a legend in the small town, a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are won not with weapons, but with wisdom, and the strongest bonds are forged in the most unexpected places.